One of the country's most important newspapers has a very important headline that it should rewrite. This morning, Washington woke up to a front-page headline in the Washington Post that is not true and was proven not true last night on this program at the very moment when that headline was actually being printed. It took the Washington Post one full week to respond to my criticism of their coverage of last week's autopsy of Michael Brown, leaked autopsy, who was, of course, shot and killed by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson. Last week's inaccurate and misleading front-page story about the autopsy was followed today by a story on page 3 of the Washington Post under the headline, Michael Brown autopsy quotes were taken out of context, expert says. The expert the article is referring to there is forensic pathologist Dr. Judy Melanek, who first said her quotes were taken out of context by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on this program last Wednesday at the very moment that the Washington Post was printing what she says were her out-of-context quotes. Here is the first sentence of today's Washington Post article. A forensic pathologist quoted in a St. Louis Post-Dispatch story about the shooting death of Michael Brown said some of her statements concerning the autopsy were taken out of context. Wow. So you'd never know in that first sentence that she was quoted in the Washington Post saying those same things out of context. So this story reads like it's about the St. Louis Post-Dispatch getting Dr. Melanek's comments wrong, not the Washington Post. So why would the Washington Post be so excited about the St. Louis Post-Dispatch printing a statement out of context? Well, for those very few readers who made it all the way to paragraph 13 of the Washington Post story today, they discovered this sentence. The Post's article quoted from the Post-Dispatch's interview with Melanek. That was one of my primary criticisms of the Washington Post article, that the authors of it irresponsibly lifted Dr. Melanek's quotes from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch without ever calling Dr. Melanek and checking with her. If the Washington Post reporters had bothered to contact Dr. Melanek, she would have warned them against using those quotes. Why the Washington Post simply lifted those quotes from the Post-Dispatch without checking with the source remains a mystery that today's Washington Post article very carefully refuses to address. The Washington Post did a terrible job of reporting on that leaked autopsy, but they still can't bring themselves to openly admit that the way that the New York Times, for example, admitted it when I criticized a terrible report on the Michael Brown investigation that ran on the New York Times front page. The New York Times graciously accepted that criticism of mine. The Washington Post actually runs an article today where they interview an editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about why that paper quoted Dr. Melanek out of context. But no one at the Washington Post is interviewed in that article and asked why the Washington Post used that quote without checking with the source. It is a pathetic correction by the Washington Post to a pathetic piece of reporting by the Washington Post, in which the Washington Post does not have the courage yet or the integrity to acknowledge what it did wrong in framing Dr. Melanek's comments for the Washington Post readers. And the only reason the Washington Post ran this correction today is because I exposed the Washington Post's terrible reporting here on this program. Now, we can hope that this is the last time that I have to force one of America's great newspapers to rewrite their reporting on the killing of Michael Brown. The reporters at the New York Times and the Washington Post, whose mistakes I've exposed, know a lot more than I do about a lot of things, but none of them know more than I do about police use of deadly force, both legal and illegal police use of deadly force. I wrote a book about it 30 years ago. I started studying the subject long before that and have been studying it ever since. There is no subject that I know better than police use of deadly force. And since the New York Times graciously accepted my criticism of their reporting, I have not found fault with any of their reporting in the Michael Brown case. Knowing that critics like me are looking over their shoulders has sharpened the Times' approach to the story. Because the Washington Post still refuses to honestly come to terms with their faulty reporting last week, I'm not confident that they even know how to sharpen their reporting of the Michael Brown case. Up next, a man who participated in one of the 3 autopsies of Michael Brown will give us his analysis of the most important part of the autopsy, the gunshot wound that killed Michael Brown.